Also know that very soon it's her turn. We'll have from OECD, the labor market economist Anja Meierkord here with us, and she's currently working on a continuous learning review that concerns particularly Finland, and it's done to help us in our work on continuous learning in this parliamentary work, and also actually, of course, is usable in other works. And she will tell us some preliminary results of the review that will be published then early next year. We'll get the date at the end. So Anja, please, floor is yours, and we are very keen to also compare to 2002 because we know that last time the continuous learning for Finland was compared at that time. Please welcome and with applause as it's even November.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I don't know what she told you before, maybe not to listen to anything I'm saying now, but I hope that she gave an introduction to what I'm also going to talk about, which is this report that we've been doing since March this year about continuous learning and working life in Finland, which was kindly commissioned together by the Ministry of Education and Culture and the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment. And so the report, as you all know, sort of comes at a critical time when Finland, as so many other countries in the OECD, is reflecting on how it can set up a continuous learning system to better prepare for the changes of the world of work. And it also, in Finland specific, comes at a time where you have set yourself an incredible target of increasing employment rate to 75% in this legislative period, which is, as far as I know, has never been achieved in Finnish history. So that just shows the importance that continuous learning will have to play in activating, upskilling, reskilling people to actually be able to join in the labor market and take up the jobs that are available in the Finnish economy. So the purpose of this presentation is to provide you an overview of the analysis. I've tried to condense it as much as possible. I understand that we have time for questions later, so maybe the detail can be provided in those questions. And I want to talk about the changing policy context, which I'm sure you're aware of, the key challenges that we've identified in the report, and then also the recommendations that we have made. Very briefly, before I start, we started quite wide with this review, and also in the context of the coalition negotiations and the preparation for the formation of the new government, we gave sort of a wider analysis of the challenges and the recommendations. And then for this final report, we narrowed it down onto two key challenges. One of them is to how can we design a system of provision of adult learning that is future ready, looking at sort of the structure of the provision, the incentives for people, etc. And then the second one is how can we make the system more inclusive? So just for you to know that this report doesn't look at everything that could be improved about the Finnish continuous learning system, but looks at those two challenges in particular. So very briefly, just for you to understand what we're talking about. When we talk about continuous learning and working life, we talk about job-related learning of adults who've completed their initial education, entered working life, and then return to learning for purposes of upskilling and reskilling. This includes formal learning, so for example, pursuing a bachelor's degree, non-formal learning, such as taking part in a workshop, a seminar, something like that, and also informal learning, learning from your colleagues. I know that traditionally adult learning, there are different terms being used in the Finnish context, one of them being adult learning, which describe maybe a smaller set of learning opportunities, for example, in adult education centers. But this is something to keep in mind, that our report looks at all kinds of learning done by adults who are part of the labor market. So this is the types of formal and non-formal learning provision in Finland that we include in our review. Don't have to read it all now, but it's basically from sort of obtaining basic education qualifications to vocational, initial and further qualifications to higher education, adult liberal education and staff training. So basically anything you can imagine adults could learn in their lives. So what do we find? Obviously, as you will well know, the Finnish skill development system is one of the most successful in the OECD. We've known this since the early 2000s, where Finland sort of topped the league table for the PISA results, the competence test of young people aged 15. And then also in 2013, when the first results of the OECD survey of adult skills, results of which are presented here, came out. That basically in Finland has a very high levels of basic cognitive skills in the adult population and is really only surpassed by Japan. In the OECD. So a very good starting point. At the same time, there are concerns in Finland that these skill levels are indeed declining. I think as we have seen from the PISA results, that actually there has been some, I mean, if you start on top, the only way is down, but there has been some sort of deterioration of the results in PISA. There are concerns that actually the rate of tertiary educational attainment is going down in Finland. And equally, if you compare sort of the data from the IALS, which is a previous version of the OECD survey of adult skills, it seems that for some age groups, maybe even the skills of the adult population are decreasing in Finland. So very good results at the moment, but with the prospect of trying to stay up there and the worry that maybe skills are actually deteriorating at the moment. And of course, this all happens in the context of pressures on the adult learning system. This is experienced by all countries across the OECD, but there's of course the megatrends of globalization, technological change, demographic change that we all read about probably every day in the newspapers that are increasing the pressures on the adult learning system and also on people to keep their skills updated. This is some estimations that we've done. This is OECD analysis from last year about the share of jobs at risk of automation in different OECD economies. I hope you can see this even in the back. But basically what it shows you is the share of jobs that are at risk, at a very high risk of automation. That means that more than 70% of the tasks that are done in this job can already be done by machines. And then those jobs at risk of significant change. This is the blue bars here, which about 50% of the tasks in those jobs can already be done by machines, which means that the people in these jobs will have to work alongside technology in the future and adapt to working alongside technology in the future. Across the OECD, there's about 14% of jobs that can be fully automated at this current point in time, and another 32% of jobs that are at this risk of change. For Finland, it looks quite good. If you look at it, about there's just under 10% of jobs that are at a high risk of automation, and then about 20% of jobs that are at a high risk of change. But that still means that 1 in 3 jobs are either going to be automated or change, according to this OECD analysis. The other big trend that I'm sure you're all aware of, and I know has been a big theme in Finland in recent years, is the decrease of the working age population. This is data from your own statistical services, which I hear has been updated, and there was some very interesting regional analysis which I need to look at since then. But basically, this shows that there's a drop expected of more than 200,000 people by 2050, so 6% less working age population compared to 2017, and that this population aging is expected to lead to skill shortages in the future, but also demand for certain occupations such as health and care services in the future. This is a very small table, so excuse my navigation with my papers. Yeah. And of course, it's fine. Thank you. And of course, what this means, these megatrends, is that the skill needs of the labor market are already changing. I mean, you know this. You know that the job vacancies that are advertised in the newspapers, the jobs that people are getting, are different to the jobs that people got 10, 20 years ago. I want to show you some analysis that we show quite often, which is the percentage point change in the share of total employment in different categories of skilled employment. So the blue one is sort of low skills. These are like helper activities, unskilled salespeople, etc. The middle skilled jobs are sort of vocational degrees often, sort of technically skilled people without an academic degree. And then the high skilled jobs are sort of professional managerial occupations. And what you can see here is that Finland's change in the employment patterns is quite different than actually to the other Nordic economies. if you look at Norway, Sweden, and also the OECD as a whole, what you can see is this classic job polarization story, which means that the middle skilled jobs are falling away, and the low and the high skilled jobs are being created over these last 20 years. But in Finland, really what you see is something that we call skill bias technological change, which shows that really the jobs are only nearly exclusively created at the high end of the skilled spectrum. So that's a very specific challenge for Finland. We have some other data that I could have shown from the OECD Skills for Job database, which shows that Finland is the country with the highest share of jobs in shortage in high-skilled occupations across all OECD economies. 9 out of 10 jobs that are in shortage in Finland are in high-skilled occupations. And of course, this is something that you also know from your own occupational barometer that you bring out every half year that shows that in the sort of top shortage occupations are very often high-skilled occupations in healthcare and those education professions. So these increasing labor market imbalances really highlight the need for a strong continuous learning system that equips individuals with the skills needed so that they can take up the jobs that are available. So what does it actually look like when we look at adult learning or continuous learning participation in Finland? So as you will be aware, continuous learning participation is actually comparatively high in Finland. So that's a good starting point, a very strong vantage point when it comes to continuous learning and working life. So this is data from, again, the OECD Survey of Adult Skills, PIAC, which shows that Finland is just behind Denmark, New Zealand and Norway with regards to the share of people who participate in job-related education and training any given year. That's 56% in Finland in any given year. And that actually enthusiasm for learning is very high. So 20% of adults who would have liked to participate in even more training than they already did. So there's those who participate are very enthusiastic and want to participate even more. And around 35% of adults do not participate in job-related training and also have no interest in doing so, while a further 10% would like to participate but face a range of different barriers, and we can talk about them in a minute. I could have shown you other data. We have the European Adult Education Survey. We have the Labour Force Survey data that all shows a very similar picture that in international comparison, Finland performs relatively well with regards to learning participation. However, and there's a very strong focus on formal education. Now, you might ask what's the problem with formal education. There is not a problem per se with formal education, but we all probably can understand that pursuing formal degrees often takes a very long time. So pursuing, for example, an initial vocational education can take several years. If you don't have a prior knowledge that can be recognized, pursuing a bachelor's degree typically takes 3 to 4 years if you do it full time. So sort of formal education may sometimes not be the most appropriate form for adults to train over the working life. And in fact, sort of what we talk a lot about is that if we really want to be continuous learners over the working life, we need to take part in smaller, shorter courses more frequently over our life, rather than to take part in this big blocks of formal education. So there's a strong focus on formal education in Finland. This is data from the Adult Education Survey, which shows you participation in different kinds of learning in Finland compared to the EU 28, and also how this has changed in the last 10 years. And what you can see here is that as in most European countries, the largest share of learning that people take part in is informal. So that's in the very top here. You can see that about, if I read this correctly, in Finland, more than 60% of people take part in informal learning in every year. That's, learning from your colleagues, maybe not knowing how to do something at work and looking up a YouTube video on how to fix it. That's sort of informal learning that we're talking about. Then when we look at non-formal learning and formal learning, what stands out is that in Finland, actually, a much higher share of adults take part in formal learning than in the EU 28. And this has increased in the last 10 years. I think at the moment we are at about 14% of adults that take part in formal learning every year in Finland, and that's only around 5% in the EU 28. We also know from your own data that a lot of adults are pursuing bachelor's degrees later in life. So what you can see here is sort of first entrance, so new students registered at bachelor degrees in university, and also at University of Applied Sciences. And you can see that sort of split by age groups. And I think what is starkest here that actually you can't really see all the legend, I realize now, but what you can see is the orange lines all relate to Universities of Applied Sciences and how strongly adult participation in this formal learning in University of Applied Sciences has increased in the last decades. I could have shown you a similar picture in participation in vocational education. So it looks very similar that more and more adults take part in formal vocational education to get degrees. And again, you could say this is not a problem, and I don't think it is always a problem. I mean, sometimes people maybe pursue a vocational degree initially, work for a few years, and then sort of obviously take the opportunity to study, especially at University of Applied Sciences, a full formal degree. But it could also point to the fact that maybe that is the only opportunity or one of the prime opportunities for adults to take part in learning. And maybe they are lacking other opportunities that are more appropriate for them. And that is why they participate more and more in this formal learning. So some questions, I think, to think about when it comes to the types of learning people are taking part in Finland. The other thing I wanted to talk about is that learning participation in Finland doesn't often lead to the desired positive returns. What do we mean by this word of returns? I mean, that's a very economic term. Normally, we mean by that sort of employment outcomes or wage outcomes. So basically that the idea that people take part in education and training to improve their labor market chances, to improve their career chances, and that this is measured by wage increases. And what you can see here is some work that we've done this year, which shows you that there are negative returns to taking part in informal learning and formal training in Finland. There's some positive returns here for non-formal learning. That means that people who take part in non-formal learning have a higher wage after having participated. But it's quite stark that in the other Nordic countries as well, that there's actually very limited returns to formal training as well as to informal learning. We're not the only ones that are finding this. There's a lot of good research in Finland that has shown that, for example, people who take up the education leave subsidy, which is often used to pursue formal education, actually have negative effects on employment and earnings up to 4 years after having taken up this subsidy. So this can reflect many things. This can reflect institutional aspects such as wage setting mechanisms, the fact that because of collective bargaining, there's not so much flexibility in the wages in Finland, for example, so that when you participate in learning, you're not automatically getting a wage increase. But it could also point to other issues around the labor market relevance of training, and also the quality of training, and therefore the sort of recognition that this training is getting from employers. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, is that adults with low skills are lagging behind. And you were referring to the report from 2002, the OECD report that we did now nearly 20 years ago, and it says exactly the same thing. That was exactly the point that was made 20 years ago, that yes, this is all very nice, but there's a large part of the population that is not taking part. There's huge gaps between the higher skilled and the medium and low skilled, and this has not changed. So what I show you here is the share of adults in job-related education and training in the past 12 months. Again, this is OECD PIAC data. And what you can see is that while about, I have to read it off the chart as well, while about sort of 60% of adults with medium or high skills are taking part in job-related education and training in any year, only about 30%, half the people with low skills are taking part in learning when they have a low level of skills. And this is the largest gap between people in different skill levels in the OECD, the largest gap. There's the other Nordic countries have similar. They also have very large gaps, but Finland is definitely leading with regards to this aspect of inclusiveness or lack of inclusiveness. So what I also want to briefly show you is that participation when low-skilled adults participate in training, they often don't participate in training that's actually very useful for them. This is something that may be a little bit of complex to read, but I just want to show you one thing out of this. And this is participation in active labor market policies, which is also part of the education and training that we looked at, the continuous learning we looked at. And this shows you the shares of adults participating in different kinds of active labor market policies. And you can see here the self-motivated training, which is basically when adults sort of themselves apply for standard qualification standard courses and then sort of continue to be supported through unemployment benefits of the public employment services, that quite a large share of low-skilled adults participate in this kind of self-motivated training, but only very, very few of them are actually in employment 3 and 6 months after participation. So the worrying thing, or what I want you to take away from this, is that this self-motivated training is increasing. I could have shown you a graph that shows that while maybe 10 years ago, most training offered by the public employment services was sort of vocational, short courses. Now, this is being overtaken by self-motivated training. And actually for this group, we're maybe most worried about, it doesn't really work. It doesn't really integrate them into employment as much as we would like to. So I want to summarize the key challenges that we've identified for this report. And again, this is all very synthesized, and I will try to talk more about this maybe in the questions. But so these are the 2 areas of challenges that we looked at, as I said before, making continuous learning provision fit for the future, and also improving learning participation for adults with low skills. With regards to making continuous learning provision fit for the future, the 3 challenges that we have focused on in our report is that the key, as I said before, there is a high prevalence of formal learning, which can be problematic, doesn't have to be, but at least we should think about what it means and where it comes from. There are some gaps in the provision. For example, which I didn't talk about yet, but for example, there's a very high share of adults with vocational degrees, as the highest degree in Finland, which don't have that many options to further upskill, apart from, for example, as I said before, the bachelor's degrees of universities of applied sciences. There's also some gaps in the non-formal learning provision, that actually there's not that many opportunities for adults to go out, find a provider that offers them an interesting short course that they want to take part in. There's also limited use of skill anticipation and assessment information for steering provision. What do we mean by this? For example, forecasts of how the occupational landscape is developing, or forecast how the skill needs are developing. You have a very good system for assessing skill needs, which has also been improved, which results have been presented this year. But it's less clear how this is really, really linked in a strategic way to steering the provision and actually let incentivize providers, incentivize employers to actually train for these skills that are in demand. And then equally for the challenges that are related to sort of the topic of adults with low skills is that there's a lack of capacity of existing advice and guidance services. I think sort of the 2 things to keep in mind there is that obviously there's already a lot of great work done in Finland with regards to one-stop shop solutions where people can really get comprehensive advice and guidance for some target groups. That includes young people, that includes people with migrant background, but there isn't really anything equivalent for everyone or for people with low skills, apart from some pilots that are being done at the moment, from what I know. And also that actually public employment services do not have the capacity. There is an incredibly high workload of counsellors. And of course, as you will all be aware, public employment services have been subject to also cuts over the last decade. And to really work with this target group that needs a very comprehensive services, something sort of also needs to change in the public employment service realm. There's close to no target provision. Of course, this is part sort of the Finnish model. Everything in theory, if you're an adult with low skills, you can participate in most things. Everything is open to you. The system is universal. There's financial support available for you to take part. But there's nothing that particularly targets adults with low skills, at least from at a national level. There are sort of municipal initiatives that do exist. And also there are very limited outreach activities. I mean, this is a problem that we encounter in all OECD economies, that it's not enough to inform, it's not enough to have the provision. You need to go out and meet people in their environments, in their workplaces, in their schools, in maybe the doctor's office, wherever the contact point is of adults with low skills. That is where we need to be to inform them about learning opportunities. So these are the challenges that we've identified, and I want to whiz through the recommendations, which in a very brief form may be quite superficial, but there's a lot in the report that sort of details with also a lot of policy examples for other countries. So I will just briefly sort of go through them, but we can maybe talk more about that in the questions. So the first recommendation is to diversify the training offer. What we mean by that is to find some way to improve the provision of non-formal learning, potentially by experimenting with some market-based solutions around non-formal learning, to think about how there can be more opportunities for adults with vocational skills to upskill, either through short-cycle tertiary education or other forms of gaining higher vocational skills. To make the offer more labor market relevant, this includes to take a more strategic approach about integrating skills needs assessment information into policy making, to find ways to include employers more in designing training, maybe giving them some responsibility to actually sort of bottom-up design some of the training provision that is out there. To incentivize participation in the right offer, what we found is that a lot of the incentives, financial incentives that exist now are very much geared towards people taking part in formal learning. So can we find a way to incentivize participation in non-formal learning? Can Finland find a way to incentivize participation in those skills or in those kind of trainings that are most relevant for the labor market? And that is a very difficult task in Finland because most of the provision is free or very low cost. So where other countries may work a lot with financial incentives, there is a question of how this can be done in Finland, and there are some examples that we have in the report. Then this whole topic, as I've already elaborated before, there needs to be more comprehensive advice and guidance, both online but in person. It is not enough for the target group of low-skilled adults to go on a website and try to find their own way around the training offers. And this has to happen to a large extent also in public employment services. Or to expand the good work that has already been done with some target groups with one-stop shops to the group of low-skilled adults. To develop tailored education programs that are low threshold, that are not necessarily leading to any qualifications, but that are just motivating people to start learning again, that are just motivating people who really might have had very bad experiences with the formal education system to gain some kind of skills, which may not always be labor market relevant, but which are just a first step towards further learning and lifelong learning. And to reach out to adults with low basic skills. And I think what is really behind this reach out to adults with low basic skills is include funding for this activity in the provision that you're thinking about and in the provision that you will be implementing in the future, because there's no point having a great system such as Finland has it when people don't know about it or people can't access it because they can't identify that they in fact need to learn and should learn and would benefit from learning. So very briefly, the 6 key recommendations coming out from the report. And as said, we're finalizing the report at the moment. We hope to have a final version taking into account feedback from the ministries and other people that have been involved. And then we will launch the report. At the moment, it's planned for the 19th of February here. And I'm looking forward to it, and I'm looking forward to your questions. And I know it was very fast, so I hope you got something from it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Anja. While the audience starts thinking about their questions and raising their hands, I think the very first comment I would like to just say that having followed, this is a third government that I think I follow quite closely this field, education, learning, skills and employment. And if we look at your 6 recommendations, I believe those of you who've been working on these issues would answer that, well, we've addressed them in various ways, but perhaps a little bit one by one, and there is now a sort of a new level, or also perhaps a little bit of a model needed that takes into account the different ministries and also different regions in Finland that actually have quite different issues at stake. So I think your recommendations are very helpful, and we perhaps feel we are at least in somewhat on the right path, that it doesn't somehow show us something that we hadn't already addressed. And if you even look at next year's budget that is just being approved, I hope, in the coming weeks at the Parliament, there are many of these issues actually dealt and hopefully also discussed by the Parliament, so that we have more and more debate in the society and people understand the critical importance of these issues. Ladies and gentlemen, please raise your hands if you want to make a comment or a question. You can do it in English or in Finnish. We'll translate it for Anja from Finnish, so if someone wants to have it on Swedish, that's all okay. Yes, please. Let's take first one from there, and then there was someone from here.
Good afternoon. My name is Salla Huttunen. I come from Haaga-Helia University of Applied Sciences. You mentioned self-motivated training, and you also mentioned that it's increasing, and at the same time that it's not really working in terms of employment. Is it the wrong kind of training, or what's wrong with it?
Well, I think it's very interesting. I mean, I understand that the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Employment is very fond of the self-motivated training. I think, I mean, if I look at it, what I see is exactly this kind of training that we are a bit skeptical about maybe at the OECD, is because it is formal training normally. It is normally taking part in long-term, several years of training. And from also my conversations here with people who work at the TE offices, I think it is very much a case-by-case decision on what kind of training people are allowed to do, and how much it is really labour market relevant depends on what the councillor thinks. So I think maybe what we would like to see more is self-motivated training, but in occupations or for skills that are really needed in the labour market. Of course, you know, we all know that becoming a practical nurse or becoming a nurse or something needs a long term of formal training, but maybe there should be some limitations as to which you can pursue as self-motivated training. This is also part of that's one of the ideas in the report. And yes, maybe it shouldn't be the only option. Maybe it shouldn't be the thing that becomes so popular that all other shorter non-formal training and non-formal learning options are sort of crowded out. Just because actually what it means is that people in the TE offices don't see someone for a long time. I mean, it's a very convenient way to have less contact time, because you know that they are actually looked after. They're obviously learning, but actually maybe that's not the learning they need at that point in time.
Wasn't it so that it wasn't working for this group?
Yeah, it wasn't working for this group. Yes, it wasn't working for this group.
Yeah, and perhaps I should add, when the word fund was mentioned, and I also represent here the Minister of Employment, that I think there is actually quite a lot of discussion at the moment. We have more analysis on the self-motivated training. After all, it's relatively new phenomenon in our system, and we know now better how much money is being used, what kind of people are using it, and so on. And I think the Minister has in several speeches actually mentioned that we have to look into this very carefully, whether this is actually at the moment in a way giving us the results we want to. On the other side, I think at the Ministry of Education, there are also some other views. I mean, and so it's a quite lively debate in a good way, I think, in Finland, and I think we should continue that. But we have a next question on this side.
Thank you for the speech. I'm Satu Ojala from Tampere University. 2 comments and 1 question. First of all, you criticized the formal education a bit, but as I recognize that I'm longitudinal labour market researcher, so we only find positive returns to all types of education and degrees, in particular in better attachment to labour market. Okay. So that's a clear issue. Another point to formal education is that most of our students in higher education also participate working while studying. So they might start in service sector, for example, but towards the end of their education, they get more and more integrated in working in their own fields. So I was thinking if you took into account this. And then the question, did you look at different types of active labor market policies, because they might have quite different returns as well?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think first on your comment about the difficulties of disentangling. I mean, I would have liked to have written the whole report about how difficult it is to really understand who is an adult learner or continuous learner and who isn't in Finland, because as you say, it's people are already working while they're studying. I mean, in an ideal world, everyone would, in data purposes, everyone would just study, then finish, then work for a little bit, and then continue to continue in continuous learning, and we would know who continuous learners are. But it's not that easy. So we have a discussion in there about this issue. In the end, what you end up doing with the data sources that are available is that you actually do just take an age cutoff. So it's normally we just look at adults 25 to 64 who take part in some kind of learning. But there is a discussion in the report that a large share of them, I think 14%, are actually likely to be young people who are still in initial education. So it's an interesting topic. On the active labor market policies, yes, on the slides, there were all the training-related active labor market policies, and there is a section in the report that discusses both participation patterns, how it has developed over time, and also what the returns are for the different groups of adults with different skill levels. Yeah.
I take one more question from my notes, as I don't see anyone else raising their hands, and that's actually concerning finances and money. Have you looked at that from the comparative angle, and is there something you would like to say at this stage? I think this will be perhaps the hardest discussion that we will have as any country when they try to reform or rethink the existing system.
Yeah. It was not one of those two key challenges that we selected in the end, and maybe it should have been one, but there's so much to discuss. There is something in the report about it more in the context section. It's chapter 2 of the report, where we build on the Citra costing exercise and sort of adapt the costing a little bit with our own assumptions. I think it's so it shows that public spending is a large share of all spending on continuous learning in Finland. It's very difficult to have comparative data. There's really only one study that has good cross-country comparative data that is from 2013, and actually the data from it is sometimes even from 2009, 2008, depending on the country. And it does show that, yes, Finland has spends a high share of GDP on adult learning, on continuous learning and working life. A little bit less than some other of the Nordic economies. It also shows that, again, if you look at some other data sources, that quite high shares are spent on active labor market policies compared to other countries. So there's a question of, why are they maybe not always effective, or why is it still that people who are low skilled and in contact with public employment services do not take part in learning as much as we would like to. And then the other thing that we looked at is employer participation, employer contributions to learning. It's quite high. There's a few data sources. There's the Continuous Vocational Training Survey, and there's also the European Investment Bank survey that has some comparative data on it. It is high, but it shows that the sort of per capita investment of Finnish companies is lower than some of the other Nordic countries. So I think what we've heard a lot in discussions with social partners, maybe there's some here today, from the employers, that employers are already doing so much. Yes, but they're actually doing maybe less than in some other Nordic countries.
Okay, thank you, Anja. I think very helpful introductory piece for us for today, and we look forward to February. I believe you will see many faces from today also then there listening to you and your final remarks of the report. Let's give an applause for Anja. Thank you very much.